So first, thank you very much to JNU Academic. I was very happy to reschedule my class at Ashoka this afternoon to be with all of you. And particularly, it's a real honor to be asked to be a discussant on Dipankar's work. I think Professor Gupta is partially, responsible. I'm a very reluctant academic. And I was sort of brought into academia, I think in some ways persuasively by him. And so I became a sociologist and a social anthropologist teaching in India in many ways owe that transition and that career path to him. So it's really exciting to have this opportunity. I was given a brief to discuss the first two chapters of From People to Citizen. So I decided to take that brief. I realized later that I could have exercised option and decided that I would pick what I wanted to discuss. But as it was, I'm very delighted to have this particular book and the set of arguments to pick up on. I walked in a little late because I was coming from Sonipat and realized that I think Professor Gupta had already launched into many of the key arguments that you make in this book in the first session. So perhaps what I'm going to say to begin is a little bit of a reiteration, a summary of how I read the key arguments, and of course, open to corrections in terms of how I've read it, right? So I think the first point, and this has been made, I think Ratheesh also made this point, that he insistently asks us not to make the mistake of thinking about modernity as the contemporary, right? It is not a production of greater technology. We have mics, we're sitting in this room, it's got infrastructures of certain kinds, urbanization. It's not that kind of development. So that's the first part, right? And I'll come back to this, but he encourages us to think about modernity as a social relation, and we will come back to what that might mean. But key to the understanding of modernity and citizenship, and modernity and democracy, is this idea of citizenship, right? So I realize this has been done, but I'm going to go over it again quickly. And so citizenship is critical to thinking about both of these concepts, modernity and democracy. And you've cited, and I heard Professor Mahajan talk about it briefly, but the importance of T.H. Marshall, right? And this idea of conferring equality of status on all, and on that basis allowing structures of difference and inequality to grow on top of the basic equality, right? So the fundamental social relation actually then becomes one of equality, on which difference then can actually grow, thrive, including inequality. But the way I was just thinking about it as she was talking about religion is that multiple identities are fine, right? The argument that citizenship will color out or erase other forms of affinity, affiliation, as I understand it, you don't agree with that. You don't think that, whether it's religion or other kinds of identity will be erased. But they will not be the basis on which society is built. Society will be built. The foundation is one of equality, on which then difference grows, right? So you can have more inequality, but you can also have other kinds of difference. So the argument that you can't have diversity and equality is obviously patently not true. But this understanding of equality is extremely important that we put into place. And I think why is the difference or the move away from people, right? The people might have gained India independence. The people might be the first term we use in our constitution, right? And I think he points out in the first chapter that the citizen comes very quickly after the people, right? Signaling a movement that at least the Constituent Assembly and the founders of our constitution found very important, that we must move quickly from being a people to being citizens. And the reason we must move quickly is because people, and this is also to point out to his point about friendship, which just got discussed, the people come together against another, right? So the people are actually, it's an agonistic term, the means or the reasons for solidarity when you have a people are actually the construction of an enemy, right? But if as citizens we relate to each other as equals, then we're drawn together not on the basis of self and other or people versus enemy, but on the bonds of fraternity, friendship, and other kinds of social relations which become very important, which is why he said friendship is actually quintessentially modern, right? Because it's choice. It's the freedom you exercise to build and transform relationships yourself, right? And it's a certain kind of fraternal flowering or flourishing that can happen under those conditions. It doesn't actually mean you can't make enemies. Okay, so I was just telling Ratheesh that at Ashoka, our core class on kinship is not called kinship. It's called kin, friends, and enemies. So it doesn't mean that there are no enemies in a modern society, but they are very different from the fundamental enemy that constructs you as a people, right? So this is the other thing that you want to take. So there is no reason why you can't have religious affiliations in a democracy, but the religious affiliations will be built on equality of status by everyone, and therefore will not be the basis of majoritarianism or a superior religion or other forms of identity which will fundamentally order society, right? So if you think about those as orders of difference, this is actually order or based on equality. So it's not like you don't order difference, but it's actually foundationally premised on equality. I was asked to read and think through chapters 1 and 2, which I've just summarized, but I want to actually pick up what is the last chapter in this book, which I actually think is one of the most important chapters. It's also one of the most important, I think, foundational lessons in thinking sociologically, which is about relationships, right? And actually relations. So one of the quotes I really like of the social anthropologist Marilyn Strathern is, anthropologists, and here we can think about sociologists and social anthropologists, use relations to uncover relations, right? Our method is a relational method. So for any concept to actually be treated as properly sociological, it must be relational, right? And colloquially and otherwise, and certainly in populist projects, modernity, I think you're arguing, is not a term that is treated properly and fully as sociological. So when we make the mistake of thinking about modernity as contemporary, or modernity as a kind of accumulation of things, right? We're failing to realize modernity is not about the accumulation of things, it's about relationships, right? It's about having a social relation. My only slight query there is that things are also things we make relations with. So I teach gift commodity exchange of value, and gift commodity exchange of value is basically about the relation between persons and things and things, and persons, right? And we try to understand each of these. So they're all social relations. So in a society, you can have social relation with things. And things also come to have social relations, right? We know that's the basis of thinking about a lot of things about capitalism, right? It's when things seem to have the qualitative relationship and people seem to have the quantitative relationship. One of the most classical ways in which Marx described what happens when you have persons and things. So what is the kind of social relation that citizenship is premised on? And from my understanding, the social relation on which citizenship in a democracy is premised is equality, right? Equality of status. What that means is not that we are all equally wealthy. It means that we are all citizens first. As the first order of business, you belong in a society as a citizen. Then you have many other forms of inequality that relate to you, right? But equality is that social relation. And one of the things I think he's saying, which I think is really important, is that this is nothing natural, right? This is a choice. This is something you cultivate, that you persuade, that you have to make normatively, make into social norms, right? It's institutions that safeguard this social relation and that keep reminding you to practice it, right? So you have to actually cultivate this relationship. It is not a relation that simply once stated comes about, right? It has to be cultivated, maintained. That's why democracy is always a work in progress. It is never complete. Like all good relationships, reciprocity is all about leaving something left to be done, right? It has to be continuously engaged. So this is what I took away from it. And I think this is actually incredibly important for this moment. And to me, at least, in many ways, very persuasive. So I had just a small number of 3 questions for Professor Gupta to think about as I read this. As I say, I am going to now read the full book and maybe have more notes for you. But for now, given the bits I read, I'd like to ask 3 questions. One is, I understand the move from people to citizen, right? If we think about the people as those constructed against an enemy. I just wonder where the public fits in. Right? So if you have citizenship, so in a democracy, do you then not have people but a public, right? And a public being a group or a collective that is built on the equality of status that citizens have, right? And I'm thinking here of the historian Tony Judd, who, makes this point in Ill Fares the Land, where he says the problem is not whether we agree or disagree on a piece of legislation, whether that's the farm laws or anything else, but the problem is the way we debate our shared interests, right? The problem for society is the way we debate our shared interests. So in a democracy, right, how is it the public, how is that shared interest question actually to be done properly, right? Like, what are the means in which we get better at deliberating and debating our shared interests? So that's the first question. The second, I think in the first 2 chapters particularly, you talk a lot about the Constitution. And actually the Constitution vis-a-vis other constitutions, which are actually behind the curve in terms of how quickly they understand the importance of moving to citizenship and moving to citizens, right, away from people. But because citizenship has to be cultivated, because it is a social relation that needs cultivation, I wanted to ask you a little more about how else it is to be cultivated, right? I mean, institutions, sure, but it can't just be ensconced in law. I mean, that has been the entire problem of the Indian Constitution. You have it in law, but it's actually in social practices, it's in norms, and I think this is why people keep recoursing to the populist. So I was wondering, what are the emic terms, right, that a country like India looks at for thinking about citizenship? Because we have lots of emic regional, specific, linguistic terms for talking about the people, right? And we talk about Samaj, and some people use these big terms, and there are lots of jati, caste, etc. But when you think about equality, what are the experiences where people themselves, not just ideated to them, I am like a citizen via the Constitution. The reason I was thinking about this is, in Harda Mandi, the way traders actually were particularly good at understanding equality. And the reason they understood equality is they said for trade to happen, temporarily, for exchange to happen, the farmer and the trader have to be equal. Right? You can't actually exchange. We are not socially equal. But for the mandi to work, we must be equal. Similarly, they had a wonderful way of understanding democracy, because they said, if you can never lose, right, in a market, if you have no chance of winning, then it's not a market. It's a fixed game, right? And so they had a way of understanding elections, because they said even if for 10 years or 30 years someone keeps losing, as long as they have a chance of winning, then it's still a game. It's still something we can call democracy. It's still something we can call a market, right? So this was their emic way, right, of actually connecting what they did as traders to a notion of democracy in an electoral context, or electoral democracy. So I wonder again, I take the point, it's not civil religion, right? But I think one of the failures that we've had, or one of the difficulties elites have had, is not actually having language, or not adequately understanding the language of equality as it is embedded in Indian society, right, in all its diversity. There is more, I think, that allows people to understand equality and exercise it in everyday life in India than we presume. And I want to ask just one final question, which is about state and citizen relationships, right? So I think the fundamental social relation is one of equality of status between citizens. But what happens when you introduce a citizen and a state agent, right? Because the state agent is also a citizen first. So actually, the state agent is also a citizen. The citizen is also, of course, the public person is also a citizen. But the state agent has been temporarily given legitimate power over the citizen, right? And this creates a certain kind of difference, a power relation, which is quite distinctive, even though it's actually based on the people having, or not here the people, but the public, right, the citizen having power over the state agent. The relationship quickly gets reversed. So how does one maintain that relational understanding, right? And this is again where I think it is a distinctive social relationship. We've just recently written a paper called Relational State Capacity, which is what happens when citizens and state agents mutually regard each other as mutually human, right? And this is actually remarkably tough for state agents and citizens, because when a citizen sees a state agent, they see state power, they see exploitation, they see violence, they see a nameless bureaucracy. When the state agent sees the citizen, they see the mob, they see the public, they see political pressure. And every time I say building a good relationship between the two, people say, what kind of relationship can you have in a caste-ridden, hierarchical, gender-biased society between these two asymmetrically powerfully placed people, right? And my point is, it is not in spite, despite them being in this power relation. It is because one is state agent and one is citizen that you can actually have mutual recognition of each other's humanity, right? Mutually occupying each other's feet. So I just want you to think about, in that case where you insert the state agent with the citizen in a democracy, how does one maintain this sense of equality and mutual recognition that is critical for democratic, operation and flourishing? I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.